Good morning. We are in Daniel chapter 9 still. We'll be finishing chapter 9 today, beginning chapter 10 possibly, but we've got 2 classes left. We're going to be wrapping up 2 weeks from today in our study of the book of Daniel. I'm really excited for the last 3 chapters, Daniel 10, 11, and 12. In some ways, in my opinion, 10, 11, and 12 are the summation of the book, as you might expect. And I'm looking forward to those classes. We'll be moving pretty fast through there. Much of Daniel chapter 11, if you've been reading ahead, much of Daniel chapter 11 are prophecies regarding history. And we're going to treat that in very much an overview fashion rather than a verse by verse. We'll look at part of it very closely just to illustrate the fact that these are very specific prophecies of real historical events, and we want to illustrate that, but we're not going to go through the entire chapter. So we'll talk more about that then. But we will focus very carefully on what is the meaning and purpose of those passages and how it relates to the rest of the book and relates to us today. So if you're looking ahead, we're going to be doing Daniel 10, 11, and 12 in the next 2 weeks after today. We may get started in it today. So last week, we were, I need the overhead. Nobody's, there we go. Okay, so we've already looked at the numerical side of this. We've looked at the dating and the prophecy as it relates to years. And what we basically said was that there was a 483-year period before the coming of the Messiah. And we began looking at that with the decree of Artaxerxes and, that you find in Ezra chapter 7. And it is really part of the decree of Cyrus, the decree of Darius, the decree of Artaxerxes in Ezra chapter 6. They are summed up as one decree. But if you start this period of 483 years with the decree of Artaxerxes, 483 years later, you land at the beginning of the ministry of Jesus, right? So we want to, pay attention to that, but I don't think that is the most important part of this. I think the most important part of this is when we start looking at the things that are to be accomplished. And we focused on these 2 areas last week. One was the fulfilling of the promises of salvation, that is the promise to Abraham that in his family all nations of the earth would be blessed. The fulfillment of the old covenant, that is the salvation that would be established in the Davidic covenant. And thirdly, the establishment of a new covenant, which we will look at a little bit more. So one aspect of the coming of the Messiah is the idea of salvation and the fulfillment of all prophecy. And Jesus, as we said last week, on the road to Emmaus, took these men aside who were distraught over the death of the one they thought the Messiah. And Jesus explained that all these things had been foretold in all the law and the prophets, and he explained himself to them. So the fulfilling of the promises of salvation was first the goal of the Messiah. But the second one is this idea of bringing judgment upon the unfaithful covenant breakers. If you're a student of the Old Testament at all, you know that the Old Testament is full of descriptions and the events where the people of God were repeatedly unfaithful to him. And he was constantly bringing them back and restoring them, and they would be unfaithful to them. And what we see in the coming of the Messiah is the consummation of the age of the Old Testament and the final judgment upon those who would not hear the Messiah. And we looked at Malachi chapter 3 last week as we began looking at this second point. And we talked about the passage in Malachi chapter 3, which begins with the prophecy of John the Baptist, followed by the prophecy of the messenger of the covenant, which is identified, we can identify with Jesus, the Christ. And then he goes on to say that he is, people who long for the judgment or long for the Messiah, will you really be able to stand in the day of the Messiah? Why? Because he is going to be a refiner's fire. And he's going to be like the soap of the launderer. He's coming in judgment upon those who would not hear the Lord. And he cautions them about what they wish for. And he goes on and he talks about the purification of the sons of Levi. He's going to purify the priesthood that they might, in cleanliness, present offerings and sacrifices to God. So in all of this, of course, is describing in figurative terms the new covenant, the new people, the new priesthood. And we looked in 1 Peter chapter 2, where he describes us as a royal priesthood. So there's a fulfillment of that. Isaiah chapter 65 and 66 describes, again, the judgment that is coming and associated with the Messiah and the establishment of a new heaven and a new earth, which I believe is referring to the period of the new covenant. And then we come to Matthew 23. And I want us to turn over to Matthew chapter 23. And we're going to look there this morning. And of course, this kind of help us kind of put the last parts of this prophecy in Daniel 9 in perspective. But I want to highlight, and this is a very important point. I've alluded to the fact that there are different views of this passage. What is this all referring to? What is it speaking about? And there are several different views out there as far as what this passage is referring to. And I think one of the strongest arguments for the view that we're presenting in this class is the associated destruction of Jerusalem with these things. In Matthew chapter 23, very famous passage where we find the woes that Jesus speaks upon Jerusalem, and he gives a litany a list of their sins, the sins of the people, and he is pointing at the scribes and the Pharisees in this list, referring to them as hypocrites and blind guides, repeatedly designating them in this way. And then he comes to verse 34. He says, "Behold, I am sending you the prophets and wise men and scribes. Some of them you will kill and crucify, and some of them you will scourge in your synagogues and persecute from city to city, so that upon you may fall the guilt of all the righteous blood shed on earth, from the blood of the righteous Abel to the blood of Zechariah, the son of Berechiah, whom you murdered between the temple and the altar. Truly I say to you, all these things will come upon this generation." So what is Jesus saying? He says, your sin is going to be made full. And you're going to persecute those who bring you this good news. And you're going to kill them and murder them as you did the prophets before. And upon you will fall the responsibility of all the innocent blood, of all the prophets who have gone before, those who spoke for God and you would not listen. And he says, truly all these things will come upon this generation. And that's really important. We're going to see that again in a few minutes. So Jesus says, "Jerusalem, Jerusalem, who kills the prophets and stones those who are sent to her, how often I wanted to gather your children together, the way a hen gathers her chicks under her wings, and you were unwilling." And of course, we're reminded of all the effort of the Lord to redeem Israel as a nation, but they were unwilling. "Behold, your house is being left to you desolate." Now, what would their house be? Their house would be the temple. You could think of it as everything that they were. Their entire identity was in the temple. When we were looking in the prophets, and if you're studying Ezra and Nehemiah, you see the importance in all of these passages of the temple. Their identity was in the temple. And he says, your house, everything that you identify with, is going to be left desolate. "For I say to you from now on, you will not see me until you say, 'Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord.'" So you will not see me again until you say, Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. That is a quotation of Psalm 118, which is a messianic prophecy. It begins with that section beginning, I think, verse 24. It begins with, "For I lay in Zion a chief cornerstone." The description of Jesus as the cornerstone in which the new covenant, the new temple will be built. And then at the end of that passage is this word, "Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord." Those whom Jesus spoke would have identified this statement with Psalm 118, and they would have understood Psalm 118 as being messianic. So what is Jesus saying here? You will not see me until you say, "Blessed." You will not see me until you recognize that I am the anointed Messiah. I am the one who is coming in the name of the Lord. I am the one whom you look for. And you will not see me. You will not understand me. You will not embrace me until you embrace me as Messiah. And that's his remarks on Jerusalem. And then in chapter 24, it says, "And Jesus came out of the temple and was going away when his disciples came out and pointed out the temple buildings to him. And he said, 'Do you not see all these things? Truly I say to you, not one stone here will be left upon another which will not be torn down.'" So here are the disciples. They're leaving the temple area, and the disciples are just pointing out the temple, because the temple, in all the land of Palestine, the temple was the greatest thing. Not only with all of its spiritual significance for the people, but just as a structure. It was the greatest thing that any of them had ever seen. And so here they are marveling and pointing out the temple. And Jesus says, really, that's nothing. All of that will be thrown down. Not one stone left upon another. And that's such an important comment that Jesus makes. He takes their awe of the temple and says, that building is nothing. It is going to be destroyed. And then he says, following this, it says, "And he was sitting on the Mount of Olives, and the disciples came to him privately, saying, 'Tell us when these things will happen, and what will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age.'" So the disciples are recognizing that Jesus is saying something important. And no doubt there's been earlier discussions among them regarding these types of things, and Jesus has just reminded them, saying that the temple is going to be destroyed, and they're wondering, when is all of this going to happen? Now, hopefully you read Matthew 24. We don't have time to go through all of Matthew 24, so we're just going to highlight a couple of things. But Matthew chapter 24, Jesus is prophesying the destruction of Jerusalem. And I know that not everyone takes that view, but I think it's very decisive when you study this passage. You come to the conclusion, if you're careful and you take into account everything else that we've been looking at, that Jesus here is talking about the destruction of Jerusalem. Not the end of the world, not the end of all time, but the end of the age. The end of days that are being spoken of in Daniel, I believe, are always referring to the end of the Jewish age, meaning the end of the Old Covenant period, not the end of all time. And I know it's very easy for us when we see the end of days or the last times, because of so many other doctrines that are out there, our mind immediately goes to the end of everything. But the phrase, the day of the Lord, the end of the age, is used repeatedly in the Old Covenant or in the Old Testament to refer to something that is clearly not the end of all time. That phrase is not always referring to the end of all time. It could, in places of the New Testament, be now looking forward beyond the end of the age of the covenant to the end of the world. But in these passages, it is referring to the end of the covenant. And if you look at what is prophesied regarding the Messiah, there is constantly this pointing towards not only salvation, but judgment. in the time of the Messiah. And what judgment is it referring to? It is judgment upon the old covenant, and it is the end of that age. In the book of Hebrews, the writer of Hebrews refers to the consummation of the ages. He's not referring to the end of all time, but he's referring to the time in which Christ came in fulfillment of everything that had been prophesied, and he refers to that as the consummation of the ages. Everything has been pointing to this. And so here in this passage, Christ is talking about the end of that age. And so in chapter 4 and through verse 8, he talks about those who will claim to be the Christ, claim to be the Messiah. Many will come claiming to be the Messiah. Why? Because, as we said before, when we look at this is the reason so many people were looking for the Messiah in the day of Christ. Because it's clear that the prophets were pointing to their time. In the prophecy of Daniel chapter 2, and the prophecy of Daniel chapter 7, and the prophecies of the four kingdoms in chapter 2 and verse 44, it says, and in the days of those kings, that is the kings of the fourth empire. It doesn't take a great deal of effort to recognize that the days of those kings, the fourth empire was the Roman Empire. So in the days of the Roman Empire, the Messiah would come and establish the eternal kingdom of God. And in doing so, he is going to remove the old covenant. He's going to be bringing judgment upon that covenant, upon the covenant breakers. So he goes on and he describes the tribulation that is to come, the great, terrible period. In verse 24, he says, they will deliver you to tribulation, and they will kill you, and you will be hated by all nations because of my name. At that time, many will fall away and betray one another and hate one another. And many false prophets will arise and mislead many. He says in verse 14, this gospel of the kingdom shall be preached in the whole world as a testimony to the nations, and then the end will come. He says in verse 15, therefore, when you see the abomination of desolation which was spoken of through Daniel the prophet, standing in the holy place, let the reader understand, then those who are in Judea must flee to the mountains. Whoever is on the housetop must not go down to get the things that are in his house. Whoever is in the field must not turn back to get his cloak. But woe to those who are pregnant and those who are nursing babies in those days. But pray that your flight will not be in winter or on the Sabbath. He is describing here the suddenness and the signs that will come, that Jerusalem's destruction is near. And he goes on. He describes, when you see the gathering of armies and all of these things. So information is being provided to the disciples of when to recognize that the end is imminent, that everything is coming upon Jerusalem. But he, in verse 15 says, he looks back to Daniel. He says, Daniel was speaking of these things. What is Daniel talking about? He says, when you see the abomination of desolation, which was spoken through Daniel the prophet, then you will know that these things are upon you. In verse 29, he says, but immediately after the tribulation of those days, the sun will be darkened, and the moon will not give its lights, and the stars will fall from the sky, and the powers of heavens will be shaken. And then the sign of the Son of Man will appear in the sky, and all the tribes of the earth will mourn, and they will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of the sky with power and great glory. And he will send forth his angels with a great trumpet, and they will gather together his elect from the four winds, from one end of the sky to the other. And I want to suggest to you, even though it may feel contrary to what you often associate these words with, these words are talking about the destruction of Jerusalem. He is describing the Son of Man coming in judgment. Judgment coming on a cloud is throughout the Old Testament, repeatedly, in passages that have nothing to do with Jerusalem nor the end of the world, but judgment upon cities. And that's the use of the language here. It wouldn't take you long to do a study of that and find those passages that we don't have time to go through right now. But the Son of Man coming on the cloud of the sky with power and great glory is him coming in judgment upon Jerusalem. Verse 34, truly I say to you, this generation will not pass away till all these things take place. Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will not pass away. So if you think about the warnings that are being given here, all the warnings relate to their time and place. When you see these things happening, flee. Whoever's on the housetop must not go to get the things that are in his house. Pray that it not be on the Sabbath. Why? Because of the prohibitions of traveling on the Sabbath. Pray that these things don't come on the Sabbath day when you are faced with fleeing or obeying the Sabbath law. Who do those things apply to? It applies to the people of that day. It doesn't apply to people now or people in the future from now. These are things that clearly were local to the people that Jesus was speaking. And of course, then he says, all these things will happen before this generation passes away. So the fulfillment of these prophecies, and by his reference to Daniel, the fulfillment of the prophecies we're reading about in Daniel, and by the way, in chapter 11, there's an abomination of desolation referred to that is the abomination of desolation's Antiochus Epiphanes in 169 BC upon the temple of God. This passage is referring earlier to Daniel chapter 9 in our passage that we're looking at this morning, where he talks about the desolation that is coming. He's referring to that desolation. He couldn't be referring to the desolation of chapter 11 because it had already occurred. It wasn't in the future when Jesus spoke these words. But Daniel chapter 9, verses 26 and 27, was still to come. So when we're looking at these passages and we're trying to figure out when are these things fulfilled, when we look at the timeline, we see that these things land in the time of Jesus. When we look at this speech of Jesus as he's describing this destruction that is coming, it is the destruction that he describes here in Matthew 24, which would happen in that generation. Those things were coming and imminent. So the judgment that is coming upon the city, if you'll go back to now to Daniel chapter 9, the destruction that is coming into the city is described and relates to these things that we see in Matthew 24. Chapter 9 and verse 26, we want to kind of bring all this to some conclusion here. Chapter 25 was the rebuilding of the city. But it says in 7 weeks and 62 weeks will pass before the coming of the Messiah. So in 69 weeks of this timeline that we're presented, the Messiah comes. But it says after the 69 weeks, it says the Messiah will be cut off and have nothing. That is, the Messiah will be killed. That's the meaning of these words. The Messiah is going to be cut off. The anointed one that is coming will be cut off and have nothing. They will be killed. In Isaiah chapter 53 and verse 12, because there are those who will say there's no Old Testament passage that refers to the death of the Messiah. Well, Isaiah 53, which is clearly a messianic prophecy and which describes the work of Jesus on the cross, says in chapter 53 and verse 12 that he poured himself out unto death. He poured out himself unto death. There's a prophecy of Jeremiah that the Messiah is going to die. And of course, you could read Psalm 22 and many other places. It becomes very clear that the Messiah would be a suffering servant all the way unto death. In Philippians chapter 2, what does Paul say? That he was obedient unto death. Speaking of Christ. He was obedient unto death. After 69 weeks, what is going to happen? The Messiah is going to be cut off. And what does it say next in verse 26? It says the Messiah will be cut off and have nothing, and the people of the prince who is to come will destroy the city and the sanctuary. The people of the prince who is to come will destroy the city and the sanctuary. And if you'll remember, when this prophecy is going out, what is Daniel told? Daniel's told, 70 weeks have been decreed for your people and your holy city. That is Jerusalem. The holy city to Daniel is Jerusalem. And so here we're told that not only would the Messiah be cut off, but the people of the prince who is to come, referring to the Roman Empire, the people of the prince who come will destroy the city and the sanctuary. And of course, the sanctuary is the temple. So the temple is going to be destroyed. The city is going to be destroyed. Aligns exactly with Jesus talking about the destruction of Jerusalem and saying this is what was spoken by the prophet Daniel. It is the destruction of Jerusalem. He says its end will come with a flood, even to the end. There'll be war. Desolations are determined. Then we come to verse 27. And I want to suggest to you that verse 27 is a companion to verse 26. Verse 27 is an expansion and an additional description of the same things that are being described in verse 26. It's not everything in verse 26 happens and then these things happen, but rather these are part and parcel of the same work that's being described in verse 26. And what does it say? And he will make a firm covenant with the many for 1 week. Remember in Malachi chapter 3, Jesus is described as the messenger of the covenant. In other words, he is coming with the covenant. He is the messenger of the covenant. And it says here, he, referring back to the Messiah, will make firm a covenant with the many for 1 week, but in the middle of the week, he will put to stop sacrifice and grain offerings. So I put a couple of verses up here under he will make a firm covenant. Obviously, there are so many that can be put here. I just put a couple. Hebrews chapter 9 and verse 15. He is the mediator of a new covenant. Hebrews chapter 10 and verse 20 is described the new and living way. If you go and look in that context, it reminds me of the new heavens and the new earth, the new and living way. That is the new covenant, the period of the church, the kingdom of God, the eternal kingdom of God is being described here. But in this place, the new and living way is referring to redemption. The new and living way, that is the blood of Christ versus the blood of bulls and goats, which could not take away sin. But the blood of Christ will. And then it says in the middle of the week, he will put a stop to sacrifice and grain offering. In the middle of the week, if you took this as all kind of referring to this period of the 70th week, the middle of the week, some will look at this and say, well, in the middle of the week would be 3.5 years. And if this all began with the ministry of Jesus in 3.5 years, Jesus is hanging on a cross. Luke chapter 22 and verse 20, this cup which is poured out for you is the new covenant in my blood. And of course, Hebrews chapter 9 is all about this whole thing of the sacrifice of Christ replacing the sacrifice of the blood of bull and goats. So in the middle of the week, in the 70 week, in this work of the Messiah, in the middle of the week, after he has preached the gospel of the kingdom, after he has preached salvation to the Jews, he's going to be cut off. And in being cut off, here in this passage, it refers to that same thing as in the middle of the week, he will put a stop to sacrifice and grain offering. In other words, that is what is accomplished in his death. In the cutting off and having nothing, the crucifixion of Christ accomplished this. He will put a stop to sacrifice and grain offering. It doesn't mean that no Jew continued for another period of years, for another 40 years almost, trying to present offerings at the temple. But what this means is he'll put a stop to it and that he puts away their purpose. They no longer serve any purpose. For the one and only sacrifice that could take away sins has occurred. And so the sacrifice of blood and the blood of bulls and goats is no longer purposeful. And he removes it and takes it away. It says in this last part, it says, and on the wings of abominations will come one who makes desolate, even until a complete destruction, one that is decreed, is poured out on the one who makes desolate. So what I put up here is the latter part of the second half of verse 27 in the American Standard Translation, which I think is a translation that gets this right. I love my New American Standard, but I think the one on the screen is a little more accurate. Mine, and most of yours probably say, "And on the wing of abominations will come one who makes desolate, even until a complete destruction, one that is decreed, is poured out on the one who makes desolate." So if you read the New American Standard, it sounds as though, "On the wing of abominations will come one who makes desolate, until a complete destruction that is decreed is poured out on the one who makes desolate." So it sounds like there's a judgment that will come upon the one who makes desolate. And we could agree with that because we know that that is true. That's the entire purpose of the book of Revelation. The entire purpose of the book of Revelation is the conflict that occurs between the Roman Empire and the church, the fledgling, struggling church, spreading the gospel around the world, hindered by the Roman Empire, persecuted by the Roman Empire. That's the point of the book of Revelation. It is the church will overcome. The church will be victorious in the Lord, and Rome, the instrument of the dragon, will be judged and destroyed. That's the whole point, in a couple of sentences, of the book of Revelation. And so we can look at this and say, well, it makes sense that it says that the city will be destroyed, and then the one who destroyed it, the desolator, will be himself judged and destroyed, because we know that that's in fact true. But in this passage it says, "Upon the wing of abomination shall come one that maketh desolate, even unto the full end is determined, shall wrath be poured out upon the desolate." That puts this final destruction, this pouring out of wrath, as it reads here, upon that which was made desolate, not upon the desolator. The wing of abominations is a little bit of a challenging passage, and I'm dependent upon those who talk about the Hebrew language. I don't read and write Hebrew. But I believe that Edgar Young, in his commentary on Daniel, gets this right when he says the wing of abominations is a reference to the temple. It sounds like, wow, this desolator is going to come on the wing of abomination, like he's gliding on the wings of an eagle or something. But the word wing here is the same word we would see in Matthew 4 and Luke 4 when Jesus is taken to the pinnacle of the temple. Taken to the pinnacle of the temple. The wing here is the pinnacle of abominations. The temple, which had become a place of abomination. Remember Jesus clearing the temple in anger because of the corruptness? And here he says, upon the wing of abominations, upon the pinnacle, upon the temple itself, a place of abomination shall come one that makes desolate, even unto the full end, and that determined shall wrath be poured out upon the desolate. In other words, the full force of God's wrath poured out upon the temple and its desolation to a full end. The destruction of the temple, the culmination of that age, is being talked about here in chapter 9. So, when you look at this passage, putting it in the context, establishing when are these things going to take place, what is it referring to? Is the New Testament looking back to these things and applying it? We see all of that. And so suddenly, the idea that the 69th week happened, the Messiah came, and then there's a gap of time, and the 70th week has never happened. The things in the 70th week we're in an indefinite, undetermined period of time, and that all the things in the 70th week are referring to something yet in the future. And that the tribulation, the rapture is nowhere spoken of in the New Testament. People get it from Matthew chapter 24, where in passages like it, the other passage where it says one will be working and another taken, and that is then extrapolated to be this idea of the rapture, that you'll be driving your car and you're gone. But those passages are referring and describing the destruction of Jerusalem, which happened in 70 AD. So we'll conclude there for today. Next week, we'll jump into chapter 10 and the conclusion of this book. I think it's a wonderful, beautiful passage. But again, still some difficult things in there as we'll see. Thank you.
Son of my soul, thou Savior.